Now in this video, we're going to start with adding in detail to the foliage part of our tree, the part where all the leaves are. Let's start by creating a brush for our leaves. Let's create a new document. You can just use like the default web size. It doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be high resolution. And I'm just going to show you really quickly how I would create a tree or a leaf brush. Using a full opacity black color, I'm just going to loosely paint out the shape of what I think my leaf could possibly look like. Just an idea, and go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. And let's type in leaf, and I simply hit OK. And now in my brush presets, when I go down there, there's my leaf. Yay, and there's another leaf I had made earlier. And now if I select B on my keyboard and select the brush key, and I can go back to my tree again. Let's try painting with that leaf on a new layer. Now let's test this out. So in your brush window, let's adjust the spacing. Let's figure out this scatter. If you move this, you can figure out how many leaves you want, how much density of the leaves you need. And in the shape dynamics, you can adjust the angle of the leaves, you can adjust the size of the leaves. And if you have a Wacom tablet, using your pen pressure, this can really determine how hard you press. Then you'd have, depending on how hard you press, you'd have a heavier, thicker looking leaf. And if it's very light, then you tend to have a very smaller leaf. Now I already have a giant library of leaves that I've previously created. If you open up your brush presets and you hit on your little arrow up here, I have an entire set of leaves that I have previously created already, like leaves of all different kinds of sizes, for different kinds of trees. Now just check them out. There's so many different shapes, and you can create your own leaf library like this. I have plenty of these that I use often. And just as I showed you before, I'm going to select a leaf that I think I want to use that's an interesting shape. Maybe that one. I'm not sure. Maybe I want to go with that looks more like a clover. That'll be good for when I add a little bit of moss and greenery to the root area, somewhere down here. I think it'll look really cool, but not for the actual leaves on the top. I really like this leaf right here, so I think we're going to go with that one. It kind of has the feel of like an elm leaf or an oak tree leaf with a nice shape to it. So we're adjusting the scattering and the shape dynamics now, and of course I've adjusted the spacing on my main brush. And now, as I mentioned before, again, making sure your shape dynamics is on. The harder you press, the bigger my leaves would be, because I've got my shape dynamics on. And the lighter you press, the smaller the leaves will be. And of course I've also kept my opacity at full, which means that when I lay down my brushes, they will be very solid and hard. They won't have that kind of layered, transparent feel to them. To adjust the direction of where my leaves are pointing at, and I'm keeping the angle jitter and the scatter a bit low, so that when I draw my leaves, they're all going to be in the same angle and they won't look too haphazard. And it's a constant trial and error thing. You can also gauge this on your own, and sometimes it's hard to tell when I put down the brush strokes how exactly they will look, especially when you have the scatter on. It can be a bit of playing with to really get the right feel to how you want your brushes to look and act. And I'm using my color picker again to just add in the dark leaves to the dark parts of the, that I had painted earlier. And I'm just lowering the transparency a bit so we can get that nice layered feel to it. And now the parts that, you know, are lighter, I'm color selecting that, and I'm adding in the leaves there. So I'm almost like filling in, you know, the detail to the bigger, you know, brush strokes that I had laid down earlier. And you know, I'm really layering the light on dark, dark on light. And this process is really nice because I'm able to push some parts forward, push some parts, you know, behind. And it makes my tree look real. It really gives it that illusion, you know, of what you see when you see an actual tree, right? Some parts of it are in shadow, some parts of it are light. And you know, this brush that we've created can really speed up the process, you know. So instead of going in there and actively painting in each leaf at a time, by doing this we're able to save a lot of time. And the scatter tool is your best friend when it comes to painting leaves. Really it is, because it saves you so much time and effort. And now just, you know, on my tree trunk where I have that nice dark dark shadow, on another layer that I'm going to move below all my greenery, I'm going to start adding in the very dark green, and this is really going to indicate the shadow. Okay, and I'm going to add this dark green to the back of all the leaves I've painted, because I think that you know, we don't want to add too much of those dark leaves in the foreground because it won't necessarily make sense, and I want to kind of hide them just to show that that deep darkness is, you know, embedded within the center of the tree. And this really adds some nice depth to our tree. And I've reset my brushes again. We're going to go back with the default brushes by Photoshop, because I'm going to go back to adding in detail to the tree trunk now. I think that we've worked enough on the foliage. I don't want to add in too much detail yet. You know, I'm going to keep going back and forth. It's like I want to bring the entire piece together at once. So I'm not just focusing on the trunk and then on the leaves. I'm focusing on the trunk, the leaves, the trunk and leaves. I'm going back and forth constantly. This way I maintain a balance to my illustration and not, you know, I don't just give too much attention to one aspect. Therefore, it doesn't look completely rendered on just one part of my tree. And now I've picked a textured brush. It's Photoshop's default texture brush. It has a very rough edge to it. And I just want to start adding it in loosely and lightly and just like layering it over. I don't know if this brush necessarily works, but we're going to just try it out. You know, the reason I'm not using a completely round brush in this case is because I want to give that rough texture to a tree that you normally see, you know, because tree bark isn't necessarily very smooth, right? So we want to bring that as much as we can into our painting. Now with that same brush, you know, I've thinned it out a little so it's at a thin angle, and I'm going to start loosely drawing in some lines. This is again, you know, it's going against the curve of the tree, or it's going with the curve of the tree, sorry. And by doing that, we're starting to make our tree look a little more interesting. That big brown shape isn't just a big block anymore. It's got some texture to it. And I think, you know, this little bit of detail goes a long way. Now I'm selecting the plain round brush again from Photoshop's default brushes, and with the dual brush, with a little added texture, I'm going to start outlining that part again because I think I lost it a bit. And using those same long strokes, I'm going to start going back and forth along the tree, and we're going to break up that big highlight shape there. And just by adding these grooves, this little bit of detail, we're instantly, you know, adding some character and some design to our tree so that it doesn't look plain in these areas. You know, these are the parts that I wanted to emphasize. This is where I wanted the eye to go. So I'm really going to add some detail and, you know, give a lot of love to this space. And now that we've added enough detail to that top part, let's add some detail to the bottom half of the tree trunk now. Painting that twirly, swirly part of the tree can be tricky, but you know, it's not that hard. It's just a matter of making sure that you go with the flow of how our tree is moving and how everything looks. You know, we're moving in with the direction of the way the tree has kind of grown. So make sure it's at that angle. And I'm always using my shape dynamics when I do this, of course, so I can have that thick to thin line, which I so love to use often. And I'm pretty much just doing the same technique over and over all around the tree. We just want to add this angular kind of brush stroke all around to really bring in that texture to our tree. I'm adding some more brush strokes to the root area, you know, just really pushing in that dark into the light. Just, you know, the angular brush is your friend. I'm constantly rotating it, constantly making it thicker, thinner, and, you know, just keep playing with it. And this part, of course, is a lot more tedious, but, you know, it's better to work from big shapes to detailed. It saved me a lot of time to get to this place. If I just jumped in adding in this detail right away, I would have never been able to get such a refined illustration, in the sense where everything kind of has come together. I would have had, you know, a lot of focus in just one particular area. But by doing it this way, we were able to start out big and work our way into the small, which is always a better idea and a better process. Now I think the right side of this tree is under a little too much light. Let's really darken this shape up a bit and push it into the background. We don't need to have too much detail here. And, you know, we want to do the same a bit to the branch as well. I think there's too much lighting in this case. Let's darken up that whole area. And again, with my thin angled brush, I'm going to start adding in those thin brush strokes to just blend it in, you know, so it looks like it was seamlessly done. And, you know, just like we did earlier on a new layer with a nice big brush, I'm just really adding in that shadow, and just, you know, pushing some parts of it to the background. I like to do this often because that way I don't just focus on, you know, adding too much detail to one area, especially after I've been adding detail like that, you know, earlier. It can kind of, I don't know how to explain it, make your tree not look as cohesive. So when you add in that big brush, brush stroke on the top of all the detailed work you did, it kind of brings everything together. It doesn't make it look as disconnected, you know. So I'd like to do that often. You know, I know it may feel like I'm repainting over the work I've done, but that isn't necessarily the case. What I'm actually doing is bringing it all together and making it make sense and making it feel cohesive. Now I'm happy with the place my trunk is at. I want to go back to the leaves again. Right now I think that they look too sharp, especially with the thick full opacity brush that I've used. So I'm just moving my layers around a bit so that my leaf layers are all together in one place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Gaussian blur tool, and I've kind of blurred out the leaves a bit. And that way they're not as sharp anymore. And when I go and add in more detail to the leaf area, I will add sharper leaves. Also want to add in a little bit of that texture that I have in my trunk to my leaves. So on a new layer and a multiply layer, I'm lowering the opacity a bit with a nice big textured brush with the dual brush on. I'm gonna start adding in some more texture to this area, just so that it doesn't look so clean. Again, you know, we want to bring in that cohesiveness. If there's that much texture and detail in the trunk, I want to balance it out a bit with the leaves. I don't want it to be too sharp. I don't want it to look too flat. So I'm just with my big brush really adding in that shadow and that depth, and you know, bringing in the same amount of love and detail that I did to the trunk. I'm adding it back to the leaves as well. Now to balance out those dark green shapes that I've laid down, I've selected the same mid-tone green with my color dropper tool, and I'm just gonna start filling in that space and not making it seem too flat or too, you know, sharp. And we're just gonna loosely, with our big brush, fill this area up again and add in a little more texture. And you know, I'm not repainting over anything. I've still got those leaves in the background. They're just not as prominent anymore, you know. They're not too sharp, not too detailed. You don't want to overemphasize the detail all over, especially considering how detailed the trunk is. We want to add a little more fluidity to the leaf area and maybe make it feel a little less refined than the trunk, just so that we have a nice balance to it. I've opened up my brushes that I had created. Again, I'm selecting the same leaf that I'd selected before and making sure that I have my shape dynamics and scatter on. Remember, by the way, I selected this through my brush presets window. And now that I have my brush selected, I'm going to adjust the spacing, the size, the angle, everything. And we're going to go in there and lay down another layer on top, and not too much. You know, we're going to add in just a few leaves here and there to just bring in a little pop of highlight or texture, but not, you know, we're not going to overdo it. You know, notice how I'm doing all of this on the same layer. I'm just constantly selecting the color picker tool and just, you know, layering down the leaves as I paint. You know, I'm going from big to small and just really making it interesting. We don't want to add in too much detail. And now with my, you know, light green tone, I'm just going to add in a few leaves here to just bring attention to this area, but not too much. You know, we just want a slight bit of, you know, a slight pop of detail and highlight, nothing too much, because in the end, when we look at our tree as a whole, the true beauty and emphasis is going to be in the trunk. And that is what, you know, that is what I wanted. That was the plan from the beginning. So that's why we're not going to add in too much detail to the top, and make sure that it just doesn't look too chaotic. You know, that can happen very easily when you're painting something like this. Now, you know, once you're done adding in all these details, I think we're pretty much done with our tree. I think I want to just add in a few final details, and we're going to focus on that in the next video.